from GAP's Ministry of Health Science Center. There is a special spirit here on Cape Cod to stay here and watch the tides move in and out, to meet like-minded people who make our place here, not by status or income or ambitions, but by our dreams, our appreciation of nature and change, our value in working together. And to know this deep desire for wholeness, taking time to be with people who you meet and get to know, some more easily than others, to persevere together for nonviolence, for healing, for ending discrimination, to surrender to the spirit of hope and of love. I was in Palm Springs this past June when the news came about the Orlando shootings. During that week, I longed to be back on the Cape, where I knew that many congregations had opened their doors to mourners so that we could come together as a community in grief and outrage. As soon as I returned, I began to work on a conference with the help of a planning committee. We dreamed to create a time where our faith would help us, not prevent us from encountering people who are different from ourselves. I called Dr. Mary Hunt in Silver Springs, Maryland, to speak on behalf of Catholic and non-Catholic people who have also dreamed dreams, working for peace and justice in the LGBTQI community for a very long time. So on September 30th, 2016, a conference, Mourning, Orlando United in Love, Working for Change, drew over 70 people, LGBTQ people and friends from diverse faith groups and of no particular faith, for worship, education, and action. It was held at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Harwich. Following our open worship, Glenn Starner-Tate presented a portion of his compelling musical biography, My Music and Me. Mourning Orlando United in Love, Working for Change was sponsored by GAP's Ministries, Health Signs, Cape Cod Coalition of Welcoming Congregations, Call to Action Cape Cod, and Fellowship of Reconciliation. A follow-up gathering will be held on November 16th at 5:30 at Pilgrim Congregational Church in Harwich Port. The following presentation are the words of our keynote speaker, Dr. Mary Hunt. It'll be read by several of our conference participants. Dr. Mary E. Hunt is a writer, feminist theologian, and Catholic activist. She is co-founder of Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, WATER, in Silver Springs, Maryland. A Catholic active in the women church movement and on LGBTIQ matters, she lectures and writes on theology and ethics with particular attention to liberation issues. She is an editor of a guide for women in religion, Making Your Way from A to Z, and co-editor with Diane L. New of New Feminist Christianity, Many Voices, Many Views. LGBTIQ justice reflects and inspires more justice. Dr. Mary E. Hunt. When the organizers and I first talked about this event in June 2016, the shootings had just taken place at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, leaving dozens of people, most of them LGBTIQ folks, dead or injured. I wrote an article calling for a pause in religion as usual, In the face of this atrocity, the single largest killing in U.S. soil since 9/11. I suggested that the time we usually spend with our respective religious communities in prayer and celebration might be better spent talking with people with whom we disagree, learning to listen and love. My suggestion found some echo, though I'm not sure how many, if any, groups or congregations had the gumption to try it out. We are doing just that today, joining with people from a range of perspectives and experiences, talking and listening, so we may engage together in effective action. I will suggest that LGBTQ justice reflects and inspires more justice.
Orlando seems so long ago and far away now, a scant few months during which those shootings have faded into memory for most of us, like a third-grade spelling test. So many shootings, so many racially charged events. Syria is in ruins, where in Aleppo 2 million people were without clean running water. Children who are the victims of airstrikes haunt our hearts. Ours seems like a world gone mad. Orlando feels like light years ago because since June, we have experienced domestic terrorism and global wars at a time when the revolution is in fact being televised. We see in front of our eyes people's lives being snuffed out, sometimes by police. All too often, those people are from marginalized racial ethnic groups raising the specter of racism. Videos run over and over, engraving violence in our memories until we are inured to it. One sage man said of African Americans being singled out by police that there was nothing new about it, simply that it was finally being reported. Houston and San Diego are added to the list of places where senseless killings happen. The list grows. In this season, it all plays out against the relentless drumbeat of an unprecedented presidential election. I will not engage in the specifics of party politics, but the first presidential debate was astonishing. The closest cognate in my mind was the famed 1973 tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. On that court, another serious woman professional with an unparalleled resume went up against a buffoon, or a hustler, as Billie Jean called Riggs as he tried unsuccessfully to show her up. Win, lose, or draw in both situations, the poison of sexism permeates the culture. In the case of the debate, sexism prevents a critical assessment of issues and strategies because it is impossible to tease out the pernicious strands of bigotry from other matters of substance. There was simply no comparison between the two candidates, their parallel universes hardly intersecting. Yet the polarization of the electorate is so profound that the outcome of the presidential contest is by no means clear. Scratch your head and keep going.
This is the context in which we find ourselves meeting to unite in love and work for change. No wonder we seek trustworthy, sober conversations, places to think through the moral morass of oppression, and people with whom to connect to address the problems. No wonder we turn to our various faith traditions, to our humanist instincts, and other ways in which good people ground and gird ourselves for the struggles we face. There is a certain desperation in the air. Tepid jokes about moving to Canada if things don't go one way. Stockpiling of weapons if they don't go the other. It's a rather dismal scene, even for an optimist like me. I approach these matters as a feminist theologian from the Catholic tradition. I work in a small, inside the Beltway nonprofit organization, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, WATER, where I develop innovative educational programs, train interns, and write and lecture on contemporary feminist theoethical issues. For more than 30 years, I've been part of the feministization of Catholicism. That means I've been part of many efforts to bring to one religious tradition the simple insight that women are human beings and that all of creation has dignity and worth. Of course, the Vatican has been slow on the uptake when it comes to matters feminist. But feminist religious work, by its very nature, is interreligious and involved with many people who have no religious interest whatsoever because it's work of the whole human community. Hence, a gathering like this is far more promising in my mind than a synod of bishops, no matter how seemingly likable and progressive their pope may be. The big difference between Roman Catholicism and many other religious groups is that there is no structure for people to express opinions and be heard by people who make decisions, much less any semblance of shared decision-making. People who come from communities that have a general conference or a synod, a general assembly, or an annual conference can take heart. You might attend one of those meetings or read about it, tearing your hair over heated debates on topics like LGBTIQ issues in the Methodist Church, for example, but give thanks that you have such opportunities for discussion that are denied to Catholics. For many progressive Catholics, the main issue is to socialize decision-making, not simply to get women ordained or even change the theology on LGBTIQ people. Without structural change that democratizes the institution, any other changes, married priests, lesbian deacons, will be partial at best. As a scholar and as an activist, I want to catalyze conversation on two specific fronts. First, I will share what we have learned thus far from LGBTIQ struggles that can be helpful to make sense and make change in our current situation. Second, I want to offer some ideas about the new place of religion in our social justice efforts. I hope these two foci will become a springboard for lots of discussion, and more so, for lots of action to bring about social transformation.
What have we learned from LGBTIQ struggles that can be helpful to make sense and make change in our current situation? Orlando hit us hard, I believe, because we have been lulled into thinking that LGBTIQ acceptance and rights have been accomplished to a great extent. No one would suggest that the work is finished, and equally, no one would deny that things have changed appreciably and materially in 50 years for same-sex loving people. I cannot think of a social movement in my lifetime that has gained more traction more quickly than same-sex love. Not civil rights, not women's rights, not disability rights, not reproductive justice, not animal rights, much less economic empowerment, religious freedom, or freedom from religion. None of these have advanced so markedly as LGBTIQ rights. There are lots of reasons for this, chief among them being white male money, white male entitlement, and white male leadership. But another reason is because same-sex love is about all of us. We all have queer relatives. We are all part of the same changing understanding of how limited and limiting male-female, masculine-feminine categories can be. We all see transgender people on television. Major institutions, including the military, corporate America, and yes, even some religious groups, have realized that basic fairness, as well as good business practices, require acceptance of people as they tell us they are. This is equally true in religious organizations where acceptance increases market share. All of this is to the good, but it is important to acknowledge that LGBTIQ progress is partial and skewed in the direction of heteronormative-looking relationships and families. Those who gain the most privilege look like me, white, well-educated, coupled, now married, with enough money to worry about wills and trusts for our children. But Orlando proved that some of us do not need more progress, at least until more of us get some progress. Likewise, Orlando helps to revitalize our struggles. Surely whom we love is important, but I submit that it pales before ecological destruction, war, and economic injustice. If we can't get something as benign as love right, how can we ever expect to get the other pressing justice issues right? Orlando came as a reality check on 3 important fronts: racism, gun safety, and religious discrimination. First, the killings in Orlando at a gay nightclub frequented by a largely Latinx population were racialized. Note I use the term Latinx to avoid the gender binary made so obvious in gender-inflected Spanish. We used to say Latinos for everyone, masculine gender always being generic, and then we added Latinas to reflect women, but the binary was too obvious. Now we say Latinx to reflect a broad range of genders. This small religious convention, this small linguistic convention, tells a big story of change. I am learning to embrace it. The faces of LGBTIQ people in most slick ads, especially for alcohol, financial services, tourism, and other high-end items, tend to be white and often male. What we learned in Orlando is that LGBTIQ people come in every racial and ethnic group. We learned that LGBTIQ people are immigrants and children of immigrants. Their struggles to love are complicated geometrically by parents who may not understand English, legal systems that start with 2 strikes against them as immigrants, lack of jobs, unequal access to education, and the like. If we can gain marriage equality, surely we can direct attention to these matters.
We learned about the deep closets that still hold sway in this country in too many places, despite the Supreme Court victories for marriage rights. Some of the people killed were not out to their families. The killing of queer Latinx people make real what that poet Adrienne Rich wrote decades ago: 2 women sleeping together have more than their sleep to defend. The massacre in Orlando was the last straw for many queer activists and our friends who know how partial our progress is, what privileges we have accrued with marriage, and how much more is at stake for us and for the world. I do not mean to imply that hard-won civil rights for LGBTIQ people should be denied or rolled back. To the contrary, Orlando highlighted that much more needs to be done to bring about equality within and beyond the LGBTIQ community, especially for people of color, people living with disabilities, people made poor, immigrants, etc. By contrast, marriage equality can seem morally embarrassing in the face of so much else that needs to change. Why did marriage change and not racism, for example? I have long believed that marriage was a conservatizing force in the culture, keeping things very much the way they are, and just adding a few new people to those who get tax considerations, ease of inheritance, and the more than 1,000 rights that come automatically with marriage. The marriage industrial complex is huge. According to one study, same-sex marriage can add $2.5 billion to the economy. It was not until I met young lesbian women in the military whose spouses and children did not have access to housing or health care because they were not married that I finally, reluctantly, came to peace with the inevitability of marriage as a justice issue. Nevertheless, and even being married, I think my intuition was right. We have to bring the same moral, financial, and activist resources to many forms of social justice. By gaining marriage equality, the queer community lost some of its claim to live out new forms of family and community, more and varied relational options, including polyamory. Now, it is simply too chancy and expensive not to get married. There are even cases of businesses, including some Boston hospitals, that used to grant domestic partners certain benefits but no longer do because marriage is available to all. Far from having a panacea created for young people following us, I beg forgiveness from my younger colleagues for not having made more and safer space for them thus far. And I pledge to them that I will encourage my generation to use the resources and skills that achieved marriage equality for other justice issues, beginning with immigration and gun safety.
The killings in Orlando gave new momentum to gun safety efforts. As telling as the LGBTQ dimension of the horror was, Orlando was equally instructive in reiterating how private citizens must have such easy, unfettered access to guns and ammunition that they can procure them and carry out atrocities with relative ease. Whether in Columbine or Sandy Hook, in the case of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, or the Seattle Mall shootings, the ready access to powerful weapons in the U.S. is simply unparalleled in the world, and many of us want to stop it. A recent Swiss study showed that the U.S. has 89 guns per 100 residents, while the next closest country, Yemen, has 55 per 100. Switzerland has 46 per 100, a high number for a so-called neutral country, due to the fact that men who are obliged to do military service keep their guns at home in case they are called up as reserves. The numbers trail off from there, with no country coming even close to us in the availability of weapons for private citizens. Orlando unleashed a renewed conversation about guns in America, but we have been discussing it as if 89 out of 100 people have guns. This puzzled me because I know lots of people, and only 2 people in my acquaintance actually have guns that I know about. There may be others, but still the disparity is striking. A recent study by researchers at Harvard and Northeastern universities shows that Americans own an estimated 265 million guns, more than 1 gun for every American adult, according to the most definitive portrait of U.S. guns ownership in 2 decades. But the new survey estimates that 133 million of these guns are concentrated in the hands of just 3% of American adults. A group of super owners who have amassed an average of 17 guns each. While the data need more study, one troubling trend is the rise of women gun owners, allegedly for self-protection, another issue of concern. Still, conversation about gun safety is deeply religious talk that needs to be a priority given the danger in the killing fields in which we live. Happily, some LGBTQ people are getting involved in this work. The Human Rights Campaign, the largest pro-gay organization in the world, agreed to support limiting access to assault weapons, expanding background checks, and limiting the ability of those on terror watch lists or with a history of domestic violence to obtain guns. Gays Against Guns was started in New York City after Orlando.
Third, the Orlando nightclub rampage brought up complicated matters of religious discrimination in a pluralistic society. The shooter was a Muslim who mentioned avenging the U.S. attacks on ISIL. Most of the victims were from Christian backgrounds, lots of them Latinx Catholics. Recently, part of the mosque where the shooter worshiped was set on fire, perhaps as retaliation. Religious discrimination is alive and well. While we were founded as a nation where religious freedom was a virtue, we have become a nation in which religious belief is still and increasingly a cultural marker for discrimination. Muslims since 9/11 have embodied this otherness in ways that are terrifying for them and scandalous for the rest of us. Sikhs have been painted with the same brush, though their religion is quite different. For Latinx immigrants in the first several generations, both Catholic and evangelical Protestant communities can be attractive insofar as they provide a touchstone with home. All people have a human right to be religious or not as they choose, and no one should expect to pay a price for their choice. Religions are the institutions that traffic in a holistic analysis of our culture. Much like art, religions provide a way of thinking about the whole of creation. They offer slices of human experience, how one group of people understands the world, its ethics, its views of sexuality, and so on. It is in our religious communities that we absorb and live out our most deeply held beliefs about what is good and where we learn to appreciate what is true and beautiful. That is why, from a religious perspective, it is a short step from LGBTIQ acceptance to deep questions about racism and gun violence. These are all part of the human fabric, indivisible but without necessarily providing liberty or justice for anyone. Living with religious diversity is a 21st century challenge. Religion, from religare in Latin, which means to tie or to bind, does just that. It knits us together in distinct clans and tribes, in communities and congregations. So when Orlando happened, it was natural that religious people turn to their faiths and other people who are not religious turn to their most deeply held beliefs to make sense of the nonsensical. Countless interreligious services were held across the country to commemorate the victims. In Dubuque, Iowa, for example, silent viewing of the pictures of the victims was a powerful ritual. In DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., I attended a long evening of prayers and speeches from religious leaders of all stripes who spoke from their hearts about the violence as if, indeed, because it had been done to all of us. I saw religion in action. But the diversity of perspectives and the common search for community, ministry, and meaning alerted me to the fact that the role of religion is changing in our social justice efforts on immigration, gun violence, and of course, sex and gender. If LGBTIQ justice reflects and inspires more justice, what impact do changes in religion have on our strategies?
If notions of same-sex love have changed in our lifetime, so too have ways of being religious undergone massive changes. Since the 1950s, when conversations about same-sex love began to surface, human sexuality has undergone a major transformation. First, we learned about male-male love. Then, female-female, though always in more hushed tones and with less seriousness, as if what women did together somehow wasn't really sex because there was no male organ present. Lesbian feminists put that notion to bed, quite literally. But in those days, I would say from 1950 to 2000, we knew what a man was, what a woman was, what two men together were, and what two women together were. Our efforts to change culture, including religion, were based on a gender binary, with some expansion of sexual options. In time, bisexual people began to claim their rightful place in the panoply of human experience, making clear that some of us really do have a broader range of objects of desire than others. More recently, trans people of a variety of sorts, whether cross-dressers or impersonators or people who take hormones or have surgery, the range is wide, have made claims on the human imagination so that we are no longer sure, at least I'm not, what a woman is or a man is. Ways of sorting people into two discrete categories simply do not work anymore, as the various ways of understanding gender, whether by chromosomes or external genitalia, for example, are expanding. Intersex people are only now being heard and taken seriously. Babies born today whose anatomy does not conform with stereotypic binary options may well find themselves living a more ambiguous life than those whose doctors made M or F, blue or pink decisions for them early on. This reality of gender variety is not the horror Pope Francis imagines. At a meeting with Polish bishops, he said, "Today, in schools, they are teaching this to children, that everyone can choose their gender." Yikes, if only. But what he and so many religious leaders miss is that today's children, whether in Rome or Barnstable, live in a world in which we know a lot more about human gender variety than our grandparents knew. And yes, Francis, there are ways to help people live more comfortably as who they believe themselves to be. There are parallels in religion where many more options exist today than existed 50 years ago. How and whether people are religious is also in flux. In 2001, Harvard professor Diana Eck published A New Religious America, in which she documented how a very Christian country was becoming increasingly religiously pluralistic. She noted that we were moving in the direction of having more Muslims than Presbyterians, something that in the intervening 15 years has certainly proved to be true. We have lived into that reality, finding in our communities a proliferation of religious offerings that enrich the whole country. The scene has changed once again in 2016. A Pew Research Center study tracks the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who claim no religious affiliation. They now make up 25% of all Americans and 39% of young people. This is up from 6% in 1990, who identified as nuns, and 14% in 2004. Until now, the nuns are a quarter of the U.S. population. Among the largest denominations, it's no surprise that Catholics have lost 10% of what I think of as a market share, due in large part, but by no means only because of, the clergy sexual abuse and its cover-up by bishops. See the movie Spotlight, if you have not. Catholic treatment of LGBTIQ people is surely a major factor for people leaving that tradition.
Okay, whenever you're ready. Cultural shifts away from organized religion is significant in terms of what it means for LGBTIQ changes in religion, especially at the level of strategy. We need to think about working with both religious and non-religious people alike. Let's look at some of those changes and do a strategic course correction accordingly. If a quarter of our population is no longer religious, then religious people need to rethink with whom we partner to make change. First, no religious tradition is untouched by LGBTIQ change, or what I think of as the queerification of religion. While it would be nice to think that religions have led the way on changes in cultural acceptance of gender, sexual diversity, I think the easier case to make is that while some religious people were helpful, religious institutions as a whole have been among the main hindrances to acceptance of gender and sexual variety. Troy Perry started the Metropolitan Community Church in 1968, before Stonewall. Catholics started Dignity in 1969. Many other Christian groups followed suit. Gay synagogues sprang up along with radical fairies, queer Muslims, and many others. All of these groups laid the foundation, both in terms of scholarship and community, ministry, and polity, to make sense of being a same-sex loving person and a faithful Buddhist, Jew, Christian, etc. In the glow of our current efforts to promote same-sex equality, let us not forget that these groups were created because good people of faith were treated unfairly, despicably in their religious homes. With few exceptions, mainstream religions acquitted themselves badly, preaching love and justice from the pulpit and making public exceptions to their own rules on LGBTIQ people until the contradictions became too much to bear. Our work was for spiritual survival. We owe a debt of gratitude to pioneers too numerous to mention: John McNeil, Carter Haywood, Nancy Wilson, Darlene Garner, Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, to cite only a tiny fraction of them. For their stories, see the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network. Changes have taken place in many traditions, such that lesbian rabbis and gay United Church of Christ ministers are common. Even gay Catholic priests and lesbian nuns are now found in captivity. But the real impact has been on society insofar as religious teachings shape laws and customs. Changes in theology and ethical teachings spill over into the larger culture. I imagine that Supreme Court judges had their consciences shaped by religious as well as secular changes. Note that marriage equality does not require any group to provide clergy or religious professionals to provide over unions with which they disagree. Nevertheless, religious recalcitrance on this matter has only hastened a second discernible shift, namely the right not to be religious.
As the rise of the nuns would have it, it is increasingly okay not to be religious in our culture. This is new. Good people of my parents' generation went to church or synagogue. They observed religious holidays, sent their children to religious schools, found solace in their religious communities and rituals in time of loss, uncertainty, or celebration. Much of that has changed for our children, for better or for worse. Good people today are not necessarily religiously observant. This is the so-called secularization of society. I sense that one of the many reasons for this change is that so many people have become tired of, indeed bored with, their religious community's failure to keep pace with human experience. What's the point of being in a place where people seek community, ministry, and meaning, the three things most of us want, and in that order, from religion, if our queer children are treated as second-class citizens, if we cannot all access sacramental offerings, Roman Catholic, 6 for girls, 7 for boys, 5 for lesbians, 6 for gay men. If we do not hear our reality preached about as healthy, good, natural, and holy, why bother? The marketplace of spiritual offerings is large and growing. We have options, though discussion of the commodification of spirituality will await another lecture. There is a third change in religion. In addition to its queerification and its drop-off in popularity, such that not being religious is fine, and that is the seemingly contradictory fact that many LGBTIQ people flock to religious groups. Religious groups, for all their faults, have distinguished themselves as places where community forms, ministry happens, and meaning is explored. As people who have been marginalized, discriminated against, told, for example, by the Roman Catholic Institutional Church, that our way of loving is intrinsically morally disordered, and our sexual ways of expressing love are objectively evil, it is surprising that any of us still have any relationship beyond the adversarial with organized religion. But if, as I have claimed, religion is a way to understand human experience, and if religious content, scriptures, teachings, and social action of faith groups can develop along with society, then there is reason to hope that there is carryover impact from one justice issue to another. Religious groups claim to be welcoming the stranger, caring for the widowed, orphaned, sick, and imprisoned. Religious groups like the Catholic Worker provide sustenance for the poor and energy to overcome poverty. Fellowship of Reconciliation oppose war, nuclear weapons, and so on. They give religion, not institutional religious organizations necessarily, but religious impulses and practices a good name. They make people who are oppressed think that religions can be helpful.
Shortly after the Pulse nightclub rampage in Orlando, an Orthodox synagogue in Washington, D.C. concluded their Shabbat service, commemorating God giving the Torah, and a dozen members repaired to a local gay bar, some for their first such visit to such a place, in an act of solidarity, and then went on to a park where people were mourning the losses. Their rabbi wrote, "As we were singing, I looked over at some gay members of our congregation and saw tears flowing down their faces. I felt the reality that we are living in a time of enormous pain. But I also felt that the night was a tremendous learning experience for me. an American bar. I learned that when a rabbi and Orthodox synagogue walk into a gay African-American bar, the opening line of a joke, but an opportunity to connect. It is an opportunity to break down barriers and come together as one. It is an opportunity to learn that if we are going to survive, we all need each other. Experiences like this are why so many LGBTQ people look to religious groups as potential allies, not only for our issues, but also for social justice in general. LGBTQ religiously infused justice work reflects and inspires more justice only if those religious people see and connect with the range of injustices like racism, anti-immigrant action, sexism, ableism, and the like. But the religions themselves must change their own teaching and practices to present a coherent profile in the world. The closest analog to religions being useful for LGBTQ struggles is civil rights. Most religions didn't get it right at first, but many civil rights leaders acted out of deeply religious motivation. And it was the black churches that led the way to social and eventually religious change on civil rights. Though much work remains to be done, but I look there for a parallel in hopes that history might repeat itself since civil rights were achieved, to the extent that they have been, by religious and non-religious people alike working together. When President Barack Obama spoke at the opening of the magnificent new National Museum of African American History and Culture, he opened his speech by quoting James Baldwin, a gay African American man. Mr. Obama began, quote, James Baldwin once wrote, "For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard." He did not make mention of Mr. Baldwin's sexual identity, but the choice of Baldwin was not accidental. The president went on to say, and so this National Museum helps to tell a richer and fuller story of who we are. It helps us better understand the lives, yes, of the president, but also the slave, the industrialist, but also the porter, the keeper of the status quo, but also the optimist seeking to overthrow that status quo, the teacher or the cook, alongside the statesman. And by knowing this other story, we better understand ourselves and each other. It binds us together. It reaffirms that all of us are American, that African American history is not somehow separate from our larger American story. It's not the underside of the American story.
How we've wrestled triumph from tragedy, and how we've been able to remake ourselves again and again and again in accordance with our highest ideals. These words resonate with our work today to make all social justice issues our issues, to use one community, the LGBTIQ community's struggles and success, as inspiration and motivation to do more, and to see ourselves, all of us, in the story. LGBTIQ justice reflects and inspires more justice.